A foregone conclusion in Syria's election. Bashar Al Assad is set to secure a fourth term as Syria's president. But what purpose does a vote, seen as illegitimate by much of the world, actually serve? And is it time for the international community to change its approach toward the Syrian conflict? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the election in Syria. Seen as a piece of theater staged by Bashar al Assad to solidify his regime's power, Wednesday's election in Syria quashed any opposition hopes for an end to 5 decades of Assad family rule. The UN insists a vote cannot go ahead before the Syrian constitution is rewritten in order to allow free and fair elections subject to international observers. Meanwhile, the US and the UK are rejecting the outcome in advance, a position Russia is calling unacceptable. Now, even knowing there was no serious challenge to his rule, Assad declared everyone living in opposition-held territory ineligible to vote. And he changed the election laws to make most of the country's 5 million refugees ineligible as well. Syria's constitutional court only approved 2 candidates out of a pool of 51 to run in opposition to Assad. They are Abdullah Saloom Abdullah, a former member of Syria's legislative authority, and Mahmoud Ahmad Mareh, who's been part of UN-sponsored peace talks in Geneva. Abdullah promised to tackle corruption, something endemic to Syria, and all 3 vowed to get the economy back on track. After a decade of war, international sanctions, and now COVID-19, Syria's currency has lost 97% of its value, and the country's poverty rate stands at around 80%, according to UN estimates. Now, with long lines for everything from gas to bread and a government unable to provide basic health and social services, even Assad's loyal supporters are wavering. So would another 7 years in power prove a tragic repeat of the last? Let's get straight to our panel now. And joining me from Washington is Bassam Barabandi. He is a former Syrian diplomat and the co-founder of People Demand Change. From London, Ammar Waqqaf, founder and director of Gnosos, a think tank focusing on the Middle East and Syria. And also from the UK, Samuel Ramani, a researcher at Oxford University specializing in Russian and Middle Eastern foreign policy. Thanks all so much for being with us. Bassam, let me start with you. Most of the international community has condemned these elections, but the fact remains Assad is still there. So what's happening now in respect to this vote really isn't too different than elections, quote unquote, elections that happened before the revolution. So what does it prove? And who is this election actually good for?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Actually, this is the election of today, and the way it's happened, it just show for us as a Syrian, all Syrian in general, the failure of the international community to support what they call the morals, ethics, or the norms of the West, of human rights, dignity, and so on and so forth. That all the statement of the Western country, at least that you mentioned, it shows that they are not ready yet to be serious or more serious to handle this crisis. This crisis is not about, and Assad being in the power is just representing the tragedy itself. He's irrelevant in day-to-day communication between the countries, between the stakeholders of Syria. Being there today, it just shows that there's no communication, or there's no consistency or negotiation, serious negotiation between the backers of Assad, Russia and Iran, and the Western. So he represents the failure of the whole international community to act to solve this problem. As you mentioned, the report, the scale of destruction, the corruption, the number of refugees, IDPs, it's all beyond imagination numbers. And all these numbers are not accurate in the sense that they are estimated. The regime didn't allow the people to come in. What makes things worse, that the regime, even he knows he's winner in this election, they didn't try to approach to the other side, to other Syrian. I mean, there's half the Syrian population are outside his control. And when he talk about Syrian sovereignty, he doesn't mean the Syrian people. He only needs the lands. So when
Okay.
he talk about Idlib, he wants Idlib land. He doesn't need the Syrian on Idlib 3 million.
Okay.
He didn't try to reject or project the idea that I win, that's fine. Okay, let's try to do a new page. What he say, I win, I put my condition on the winning. The people who oppose me are not part of the Syria anymore. They are not allowed to come back. They are not allowed to vote. They are not allowed to get their own properties or their own lands back. And that's it. This is so he is creating more
Okay.
damage to the Syrian society and the Syrian political case in general.
Ammar Waqqaf, is that true?
No, I don't think so. Let me start where Mr. Barabandi ended. So you have this problem that there are two factions of Syrians, basically. Each of them have a different kind of Syria, apparently, in mind. Now, these two parties need to agree. Now, if you look at this election as, an opportunity for various politicians to win the hearts and minds of voters and seek mandate for their programs for the future to be implemented, then this is not as such. But if you think about it as an opportunity for a group of Syrians, a certain faction of Syrians that has been ignored for the past 10 years, to reaffirm their options, their will, basically, then it is pretty much legitimate. This is exactly what those Syrians want. This is the kind of Syria we want. Now, in terms of reaching to the other side, I think we have a problem here in that the other side hasn't conceded defeat yet. They don't want to concede defeat, and part of the decision making isn't really theirs, or at least part of them. So you have other interests, like the interests of regional powers, like the interests of international powers, who would want these people to hold firm against re-assimilating into the Syrian society. In your introduction, you mentioned something that laws have been changed or the goalposts have been shifted so that people cannot vote. They can vote, they could vote, but there are countries like Germany, like Turkey, who prevented them from voting. People in France, they could go whether they liked Assad or didn't like Assad, whether they were supporters of Assad or not supporters. All they needed to do is just to register and cast their vote, whichever the vote was. So, a sense, the issue, and again, talking of Mr. Barabandi's point, final point, the issue of reaching out to the other side is very important, but in my opinion, it is dependent on the other party saying, okay, we give up, let's just sit and talk about it.
Okay.
Can I answer him?
Yeah, go ahead, Bassam.
Not mine. Yeah, Mr. Waqqaf, I fully agree of your point, but I'm trying to differentiate between two things. Civilian, we have 3 million Syrian in Turkey, we have 1 million in Jordan, we have 1 million in Lebanon, this 5 million by themselves. And if we have 3 million in Idlib, 2 million in the Jazeera region, and around 500,000 in Daraa, we are talking about 7 million, they have nothing political affiliation. I understand when we talk about, let's say, Syrian Etilab, or Syrian political position, who claim to represent the Syrian people. I'm not talking about this group. I'm talking about the regime. If they are sincere to have a new page with the Syrian, let's say, guys, all political opposition, I hate you, I will not communicate with you, and I don't deal with you. You represent the interest of the countries you are living in. But the 3 million Syrian in Turkey, they don't represent Turkey. And 2 million who lives in Jordan and Lebanon, they don't represent Jordanian and Lebanese. And all these people, they have the right to come back home. So if the regime is sincere in opening a new page and using that election that everybody from the other side claim it's fake, he can say, okay, I will release the prisoners. I will do whatever can I do to bring all these people back. I give them, all these people, they fear the regime. They think the regime is killing machine that nobody can trust, and that's why they don't come back. It's not about the constitution, and it never was about election. It's about the mentality of the regime. So I think if the regime is interested, he can reach out to these normal people. Forget about all politicians, if we call them politicians. Myself, I don't call them politicians. Of all this political
I will
elites.
answer you later, but I'll give I'll give
Okay.
way to the other guest. I
Absolutely.
think we have to be a little
Yeah,
bit polite about
and,
it.
and I just think we also have to acknowledge the general consensus, that no matter who is really allowed to participate in this election, it is that, as we said, and it's overstated, maybe foregone conclusion that Bashar Al Assad will be the only one declared winner, no matter who really is allowed to participate. But let me turn to Samuel about who is participating in this election. And Samuel, if you can talk about the other candidates that are on this ballot, Abdullah Saloom Abdullah and Mahmoud Ahmad Mareh. Who are they, and what do they get out of this, if anything?
Well, I mean, there's the two candidates that are basically on the ballot, I think, are largely token candidates. It's very much like the election in 2014, where when Syria had made its transition from being a one-party state by law under the Ba'ath Party rule into a nominal multi-party state, you had another candidate who won 4% of the vote. So I think that these candidates will probably mirror something like this. Abdullah and Murat. So one of them is actually a former member of the opposition who's who participated in the Geneva process in 2017, and the other is a former MP who was affiliated with the Socialists, and their agendas are largely to somewhat some degree unclear, but they're focusing on economic recovery, they're focusing on anti-corruption, but their actual ability to kind of project platforms in the Syrian media and in the social media space is very limited. They have Telegram channels, but Assad's media infrastructure is obviously much bigger than that. And I don't think that they'll be doing much to shape the role on issues like reconstruction or on the just recovery of Syria's economy, like in terms of substantive change in policy.
Okay. Ammar, if I can get back to you quickly, because you talked about a group of Syrians that you feel have been mostly ignored for the last 10 years, and those are, I'm assuming you mean Assad's actual supporters. Do you think then, clarify for me, that the West in particular has maybe underestimated how much core support there really is for Bashar al-Assad within Syria?
They did it on purpose, in my opinion. That's very much true. The whole point was to portray what happened in Syria, that people revolted against a dictatorship or an unfair regime or a criminal regime. But what happened really was that two groups of Syrians, for various reasons, had two different ideas. And so what we see in Syria, what we have seen for the 10 years past in Syria, in my opinion, is a form of civil war. Down the lines of projects rather than sects, because you have different sects here and there. But so this opportunity, this sort of elections, so to speak, is an opportunity for those people to say, we are still here and our voice needs to be heard, and we choose to continue with the current setup, i.e. the current Syrian Republic, rather than overthrow the current authority. But this is only one reason why, going back to your question, whether President Assad is going to be the winner of this election. Yes, he would be, in my opinion, not only because these people want to reaffirm their choice, but also, practically speaking, before them, he would be the only one who could give an order and that order would be followed. So also for practical reasons, they need someone to keep the state together, which is one key objective they had from day one. They didn't want the state to disseminate into chaos, like what happened in Libya or what happened in Yemen or in Iraq after foreign invasion. So that also is a reason why President Assad would win. Now, going back to Mr. Barabandi's suggestion. Now let's think of the people of Idlib, where he, whom he mentioned. I invite everyone to rest assured that there are lots of people who are now currently out of Idlib and refugees in either Lebanon or even Turkey, or let alone Jordan and other places, who do not want to go back there because there are Al-Qaeda affiliated groups over there. And those people would very much be waiting for President Assad and the Syrian government to liberate that land. So the notion that the people of Idlib don't want Assad, that's not true. There are lots of people who are willing and actually eager to go back to their houses because they were kicked by the wrong people, not because they are afraid of the regime brutality. And asserting or reasserting the reconciliation issue. Really, I'm talking as a Syrian citizen here. This cannot be made when all the negotiations and all the notions from the other side are like, the fall of the regime is imminent. There is nothing that is going to happen unless Assad is out of power. It means that we're not going anywhere. They need to concede for this to stop and for the other party to reach, okay, we know what the end of the game is, let's sit and talk to each other.
Okay, Ammar, you might not want to phrase it this way, but having taken all your points, I mean, it almost sounds like people, or many Syrians are now just defaulting to what is the least bad option, which is arguably that you're putting forward, Bashar Al Assad. But let me return to Bassam.
You could
go ahead.
You could phrase it as such from day one. I don't believe this is the point, but you could frame it as such from day one. There were lots of Syrians who said, okay, we do not want chaos, and our best option lies in keeping the state on its feet. I am sure there are many people who did not join with the revolution because they had that sentiment. And there are other people who felt threatened by the other project and who wanted to defend themselves and saw Assad as their best option. Okay. I cannot speak for everybody, but there is a spectrum, obviously.
Fair enough. And Bassam, for as much as people believe this election may be unfair, it's not just about the facade of choice covering what's really just a one-party state. It's also about the opposition, as you yourself has said, not being able to put forth a strong enough alternative. Why is that?
Yeah, I will back to the argument with Omar, Mr. Omar, if you don't mind. I'm a diplomat. For 6 or 7 months when I was in my job, I really hope that the Assad and his regime will. I believe in the country. I believe in the institution. I believe in the strong state, in a way. And I hope for the first 6 months of revolution, and it is revolution, it's not civil war, that Assad will take the steps that he was encouraged and supported domestically and regionally and internationally to reapproaching and restructure the government and the laws in the way to be less restricted and more freedom, in order to use your word, keeping the state as it is. And he failed. He failed by the mass killing he did from day one, but it was increasing day by day. All the sector on Syrian society, they were revolute in the early 6 months, at least from 2011, from Latakia to Afrin, to Hasaka, to Damascus, to Daraa, to Deir ez-Zor, to Hama Halab. People, they were from all sects or religion, they went to the street asking for democracy, human rights, counter-corruption, and this kind of stuff, and they were killed. And I don't want to go to the history to how it was, but it's all this documented. So today to say he is the option, I doubt he will be the option. As long as Assad and his regime is staying there, he created, it's well known that he released in the early 2011 all the terrorist group who came from Iraq, who later they established HTS. He empowered PKK in northeast Syria, or Jazeera. Assad staying in power needs to have terrorist group around him to justify his existence to the international community. In Idlib, there's the best estimate, there's 20,000 of HTS, but there's 3 million civilian. The Russian, they have checkpoints, many crossing ports between Idlib, under Assad and Idlib, outside Assad, and they were asking the people to come in, and nobody crossed. People in the Rukban, out of nowhere. The Russian, they say come back, they double. The idea, the whole idea, nobody trusts that regime. This is the key word.
Okay.
I'm not saying that people should. So I'm not saying that.
If I may say one quick word, I think. Please. If I may say one quick word, please. I think you're over-crediting President Assad with all this stuff. I don't think President Assad created Al-Qaeda. I think the Americans and the British did in the 70s and 80s of last century in Afghanistan.
I'm talking about Syria. I'm talking about Syria, and we have details, their names, when they were in Sednaya, when they released from Sednaya. What kind of
but he didn't ask people to follow them. The people asking for democracy shouldn't have followed jihadists.
They managed to infiltrate Syria nonetheless, really, regardless of where it was started.
You cannot take out of account the last thing. that these people, the Syrian, they were under huge pressure of daily killing, barrel bombs,
Okay.
destruction, everything.
This narrative of it's all Assad's fault.
You know what? I'll tell you what. I need to bring Samuel, if we can, back into the fold here. Samuel, if you want to give your reply.
I just want to say, because as you mentioned, Assad is the head of chain of commands. This no doubt, no question about it. Before 2011 and after 2011. So to say there's all this killing machine he doesn't know about it or he doesn't control it, this big questions. We know till today, he's the head of command and he's the chain of command. So to say, I'm giving him all
Sam,
the
you know what? I'll
reply in my turn.
Okay, the clock is ticking, and I did want to bring Samuel back into the debate here. And Samuel, also, if you can, because what we've been seeing on screen throughout this conversation has been a lot of video and pictures of Assad actually voting in this election alongside his wife Asma, voting specifically in Duma. And I want to get your opinion as well on why you think it was necessary and if it was politically savvy for him to be voting in what was the original opposition-held area of Duma, where many say the revolution really got its foothold.
So absolutely. So just a quick response to the previous comments. Obviously, we've never really had a democratic election in Syria, so it's very hard to actually gauge Assad's actual level of support, because the first two elections were won in excess of 99% of the vote in 2000 and 2007. And it's also important to keep in mind Hafez al-Assad's repression in Hama led to basically a clamming up of Syrian opposition from public activity for several decades until the civil war. And there also wasn't much in the way of free media, social media access. It was so much so that when the Arab Spring hit, Syria was seen as the island of stability that wouldn't have been affected by some of those transnational currents. So I just want to keep in mind that it's very difficult to assess how much Assad support there is. A senior Russian official who I spoke to in 2015 at the start of the Syrian civil war told me that Assad probably has around the support of 1/3 of the population or less. So our goal is to make sure that those people are protected, but we also acknowledge he's not a majority stakeholder. So even the Russians, whose tune may have changed subsequent to that, were skeptical of the fact that Assad had a commanding majority of support in private discourse relative to the opposition. So I want to bring that anecdote to the table from my own research. With respect to Assad voting in Duma, I think that's absolutely very symbolic. I mean, Assad wants to show that he has basically reunited all the integral parts of Syria, Damascus, Aleppo, and there's just a small number of extremists in Idlib and Deir ez-Zor, and the Kurds who are to some degree repressing against his rule. And even with the Kurds, he's been making agreements with the Kurdish group since October of 2019 to kind of bring them into the Syrian fold. So he's trying to show that he's got complete control over the country. Of course, that's unrealistic when you're denying franchise to the people in Idlib, and you're denying people who have not lived in Syria for 10 years the chance to run as candidates, because that means that being a natural-born Syrian now means staying through the civil war and supporting him, not being a Syrian by birth. So there's a lot of double standards here, but it's good messaging for him and some of his international supporters who are the election observers: Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and other anti-Western countries.
Okay. Ammar, if we can, we're down to our last few minutes, so I do want to move this forward. I mean, if it is indeed this foregone conclusion that Assad will take power for another 7 years, according to this term, if he does claim victory in this election, what happens to Syria? You have an economy that is absolutely collapsing. That is what some argue can ultimately bring leadership down, regardless of any international pressure. If the economy collapses, the leadership goes with it. What do you see happening?
Well, if you think that how Syrians inside Syria view things, then it would be a little bit clearer. They see themselves in a state of war. They see a blockade from the outside, just like, you know, what happened to Britain in World War I and World War II. They couldn't find anything or any air to breathe. And then do they change leadership? No, they just hang on to what they have. Otherwise, things are going to be or to get worse. That's the mentality. Now, moving on, we can see signs that the Arab world is becoming more open to re-establishing connections with Syria. We've seen the Syrian Minister of Tourism visiting Saudi Arabia. This was unthink of 6 months ago. There are initiatives that are taking place, and apparently people are starting to warm up to the idea that Assad will remain in power for a while. Now, to try and end the previous discussion, thinking of this problem as people versus Assad is wrong. People inside Syria who have kept the state on its feet for the past 10 years deserve credit and deserve recognition. And the other Syrians who tried everything and still trying, because we're still hearing people trying to impose as much sanctions as possible, trying to bring NATO in or whatever it is. It is reconciliation between these two groups that are going only to save Syria. And if we keep hearing it's all Assad's fault, and if we change Assad, everything's going to be fine again, it's not going to work. Those people need to readjust their narrative and target Syrians who kept the state on its feet. See what their interest is, see what their fears are, and so on. And not keep talking about Assad this and Assad that, and he invented this and he invented that. I think that's the way forward. That's the only way forward, in fact.
Ammar Waqqaf, I will have to give you the last word because very unfortunately we're out of time. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us and thank our viewers for tuning in as well as always. See you next time.